Hello everyone, another question and answer video today about the army organization series I make on Schwerpunkt, and naturally more in general the medieval army organization, I guess, as the question mostly points toward that direction. And it is correct because I mostly made army organization videos about that. And it's a very interesting and polite question from a colleague, by the way, fellow historian, who says, "Hello Schwerpunkt, I have one question for you which I need your help to get an answer on. In a lot of your videos you are talking about the quote-unquote army organization in different countries and through different periods of time. You have probably already answered that question, but I am curious to know why you have a great fascination and interest in talking about army organization. And this topic, is this a topic in the military historiography where there is a lot we still don't know, since you want to talk about it? Is there basically some interesting patterns we don't know about where quote unquote an organization was understood differently in different cultures? Or is there too many similarities in regard to how people understood quote unquote the army organization during the Middle Ages? I have a degree in history, and we never talked about something like an quote-unquote army organization in the Middle Ages. I think it's because that the mainstream opinion is that most of the armies in the Middle Ages Europe looked like each other, and the concept of an quote-unquote army organization was quite static in those years. But I may be wrong. I hope you will help me, or you will link to one of your previous videos where you are talking about the topic in a mere broader perspective. So again, thanks for this very interesting question. As a matter of fact, for many reasons. First of all, because I actually never answered the question, has never been posed. When I make this Armies organization videos, I just talk about the relative army, and I don't give an explanation why I do it. I still haven't made a video about organics in history, which would clarify some aspects at least. And also, it is in fact a legitimate question for a number of theoretical and practical reasons connected to the historian's craft, in a broader sense. So it's a bit difficult. I don't know where to start from. I go in order. So first of all, the army organization here, as it's broadly meant in a historical sense, it was a universal phenomenon. That is, every army is organized naturally, and it may seem a banal, needless premise, let's say, to this, but it's important still because of the universal key of interpretation through which I study history myself in a diachronic and comparative sense. Right? I study specifically the history of the art of war, which is different from military history, as differently from the latter that studies war in general, and also with aspects that do not necessarily have to do with the employment of armies in campaign on the field. Probably has to do with the studying of strategy, tactics, so properly the choices, the command choices, and armament development throughout history, and specifically, so meaning comparing all the various human military activities, let's say, in this field, in order to get a comprehensive understanding of what war is, not much for the sake of differentiating it, but for having, in fact, a universal understanding of what war is. And this is von Clausewitz. Naturally, when I make these videos, and it is important to stress, and I often do it in the same, also when I make, for example, the military units series, etc., I normally say every once in a while, here we're making an approximation, because there is no such thing like, a standard pack army organization for that people that is fundamentally, as the question in fact understands clearly, and we will expand on it in a while, as well as there was there is no human being that is like the other, and war is always changing. It has a forever fluid and say evolutionary and adaptive essence, and therefore there is no army that is the same, there is no soldier that is the same. And failing to understand this through structuralist interpretations, kind of crystallized ideas of how things change also through military reforms, very often are just the formal sanction of a process that autonomously happen in armies, right? Instead, people focus because they are somewhat obsessed by, let's say, at least the wrong side of leadership. Like, people are exalted by individuals and often don't look at the broader picture there in a political and social sense that is always what stands beyond the military dimension. So that is very important to stress, because my plan is, of course, covering as the whole military historical spectrum. We mostly start from the Middle Ages, from ancient history, through essentially an encyclopedical account of all these different approximations that, however, have to, as we've just said, have to bring to a more comprehensive understanding. I don't know whether YouTube and videos and in fact separate chapters in this regard are the best format for doing it, because I realized through analytics, YouTube stats, that people fundamentally click on these videos for reasons that are fundamentally they want to search the history of a specific country. They don't give a damn about the rest, right? Not even what was happening literally next door, and making an effort to understand. So there is a great fixation with this, and it reflects exactly the modernistic, also technologistic, and politically speaking, worse things actually of our world, and the lack of a synthesis capacity in properly in popular culture about history. It's kind of obvious because we're not all historians, but also in properly from historiography, because that's also included in the question. I think it's very important to focus on this. I could say this before I forget, that I made a video that, while not answering this question, kind of expands what I'm talking about. This is from last winter, spring. If you search on Schwerpunkt, you with the automatic function, you find it's titled "Did we get or have we got medieval warfare right?" Because that was a reflection on my my experience in my doctoral research exactly about this. I wrote a 150 pages chapter in my thesis exactly dedicated, paradoxically, to the army organization, to the numbers specifically. That is to say, not what was, let's say, prescriptively stressed by statutes or other dispositive sources, etc., but what we can trace from properly what happened on the field, right? And that is by far more important in a strictly history of the art of war sense than fixating with a specific anchor, a specific point of reference that, however, is somewhat unhinged from the reality of war. This is a great problem we have in historiography, because historiography is getting lazy and hyper-specialistic, and you understand that for this reason, albeit military historical studies are well developed in general, they fail in the diachronic and comparative perspective, right? Because at this point, scholars focus ever more on specific times and places. They narrow everything down to that field. I had terrible experiences that I anecdotally refer to this at some point in videos, of people literally like medievalists like me that they study just the history of a single city in the Middle Ages, and you ask them what are the sources for the first half of the 14th century, and they answer you should know that I'm an expert on the second half of the 14th century. We're completely lost the plot, right? It's a scale of radical unawareness, ignorance, incompetence, and that on anything that basically alludes the PhD topic these professors chose, and you understand that they're for economical interests. They're just trying to carve their own niche for academic career, and or to publishing and so on, and they factually don't give a damn about properly history for the curiosity and the thirst of knowledge and the moral, the positive fallout that can derive from instead an unprejudiced and this way of approaching history for the sake of it, and naturally also its application in this regard. So in this video I will it will be probably a long video, but I will try not to digress on that specific aspect. In a broader sense, there is the Historian playlist that contains a bit all these broader reflections on historiography and such problems, chiefly related to military history, that can help to understand better what I'm talking about. So for me, it's really important to stress that at this point, like at this point, I'm not a professor, I haven't been teaching, etc. But in theory, I got the highest internationally recognized academic title in terms of research, etc. And therefore, I've done fundamentally what it takes to be there. And I realized, comparing my work also to one of other scholars, hearing to some objections, etc., that the level of incompetence that exists, that properly of unawareness of it's a trick. You see, it's all a mind trick. It's always a matter of perspective. A matter of perspective, right? As you know, I am for authority, I am for hierarchy, I am for order. I say from the orthodox side, right? I know I'm not an heretic or a rebel. I don't like that, because I believe it's anti-civilizational in essence. Albeit that has to exist, but in a lesser part. And I think we're losing the plot exactly in that direction, and also the reason why these things happen. But this is true for every field. Like, do you think, I don't know, that here, that I shoot against everybody? I talk bad about historians, I talk bad about doctors, about engineers, about economists, about everybody, because that is the level of we are still living in very primitive times, right? You don't have to think that people that have a title, a degree, a sheet of papers, I tell you, because I have it. And this doesn't mean that they haven't worked or they haven't doing anything, or they are completely unaware. But let's say in terms of philosophy of science properly, we know that the problem now is not what we can scientifically get, but how we can applicate that satisfactorily for a positive development of civilization. And there is a huge crisis, especially say since I think the 70s, and especially in the so-called hard scientific field, that this is quite evident. There has been hardly any substantial progress in you say this has nothing to do with how certain technologies are eventually spread in application. This has to do properly with the essence of the same, how much we have concretely gone beyond from a qualitative point of view. And part of this is due to the fact that we have lost synthesis capacity. And again, I can't explain why this happens, but let's say that we're speculating too much and we are surrendering too much to, let's say, to formalistic explanations. Like, historians today dismiss everything you say if you don't quote it from, let's say, somebody else's work, right? Or if you don't write a work, right? And even when you write that work, they don't believe you, they don't trust you, because they don't understand what you did. They don't have time to study things aside from reading them anymore. It's all become just a procedural, bureaucratic process. Nobody learns for, again, the sake of properly of knowledge and of need of that information. And this is a massive problem, and I'm sorry I digressed at the end of the day with this, but it's crucial to understand properly what we're talking about. So answering the first question that, in fact, I never answered before, you're curious to know why I have a great fascination and interest in talking about army organization. Well, organics is the component of the military art that deals with the predisposition and organization of the armed forces and the armament which they are fundamentally provided. And thus, this has a deep strategical and political meaning, because organics preoccupies itself to spot and to build the more adequate military instrument for the wars that we are prepared to fight, to deal with. Now, this takes into consideration fundamentally certain fields and their coordination. They're fundamentally the administrative one, that is in base of which troops are recruited, supplied and paid, and the tactical operational one, that is the one relative to the employment in campaign, right? That also has naturally a broader strategical meaning. And importantly enough, and that's why I also make as make an armies organization series, there's also the one about tactics for the same armies as well. In fact, in the first videos, I deal also in part with the tactical problem as well as the strategical one, because they are unavoidably interconnected. The employment and campaign demands the articulation of lesser information relative to the doctrines of employment and of maneuver in battle, defining useful subunits that are necessary for tactics according to doctrines, right? And if we're speaking of modern organics, this is born around the Renaissance, right? And especially during the 30 Years' War. And while it is true that the armies that were coming out from the Middle Ages and the mercenary ones were composed by companies that had a somewhat too floating, let's say, consistency for the tactical doctrines that were experimented in those years, still this is to be understood in relative terms to the current developments. And this naturally doesn't mean that in the Middle Ages such doctrine, albeit often not explicitated, not rationalized, not systematized, and written down, didn't exist. This is also a very important aspect that gets down to properly why we studied this, right? Because as we explained also in the Von Kriege series, the theory of the art of war is literally, born in the Renaissance, right? In the West, there were previous things in the ancient world, etc., but properly in a modern sense, we can trace this development in a rationalized sense, a conceptualized sense, only from those times onwards. And we always have to be careful as historians also in spotting what is there, like the ideal and the reality, as naturally this literary genre wasn't born at the moment with all the fully scientific, rationalized characteristics. You have to wait von Clausewitz fundamental for having that. Just the other day, yesterday, I was re-uploading that video I made about Raimondo Montecuccoli as the milestone in military theory between Machiavelli and von Clausewitz. That explains exactly this passage, because there is all an evolution of that thought, right, for the sake of positive applicability. And guess what? Before manuals, the world still functioned the way, effectively, right, for the means available. And the reason why this theory was developed was naturally also the fact that the system was growing to be so great and say developed and complicated that it needed some kind of theoretical background to fluidify eventually the practice. That, how we know in Clausewitzian terms, however, cannot be achieved but through direct command of an army. That is, you can study the theory of the art of war as much as you like, but until you don't go at war commanding, not as the normal flying rank soldier that often doesn't factually understand anything about war, literally, if not the most atrocious sufferances of it that are, not, they're just a consequence of it and not what's really about. And the most important thing is really about or military history. That is a complementary knowledge, right? You can't, let's say, here we can't also digress on the reasons why von Clausewitz comes up with that, but it's fundamentally rooted in reality, right? That is, military history has this is documenting real war. Right, it's not you can derive a positive theory of the art of war, as von Clausewitz does, because it's talking about things that happen in the real world. You're not speculating on a geometrical base and a mathematical base that eventually has no application, right? And this is also crucial to understand, and that's why also the Armies organizations videos are based on chiefly. I answer in advance partially to one of the other questions. That's why we study army organization, because we often don't know out of the effective battle of the sources to document how these armies were, how they were on a regular basis in times like the medieval one, for example. But don't think that for a great part of the modern age, or naturally this is more understandable, the ancient world, this is not true, right? There is no Middle Ages, factually, as no other era. Concretely, the point is always that when we study history, we are looking at something that came from reality, right? That doesn't mirror truthfully what happened, of course, and that's why we exist as historians. But because it's still based on reality, and actually, I must say that the more I study the art of war in this regard, the more I see that everything is much more logically and rationally frameable than we often used to think. And part of the reason is that once you get used, in fact, to the diachronic and comparative method, you get a bit weighted to answer questions, even when, let's say, not you don't have the evidence for it, but let's say when you it's as if you could read the universal military logic through basically any reality that you're studying, and surprise, every time all the pieces that you were searching for that you find, let's say, fit that interpretation, right? And you can find confirmation to it. This is the wonderful Clausewitzian trinity that, aside from war, also invests politics and society, and that's why also I make armies organization videos, because through such interpretation, which most historians and even military historians do not really care, because I know a lot of historians and very good historians that studied things military, but that, for example, never studied von Clausewitz, and they don't concretely even know what it says, right? And that you understand they don't have a mind shaped in the way that allows them to understand certain things, and therefore it becomes even complicated to make some logical points to them, because they don't own that logic, right? That is not that they have an alternative one, it's that properly they don't know what you're talking about. And without that previous experience, you can't quite make them really understand. So this is interesting, because in these days I wanted to make a video about communication in history. Or better, the importance of historical communication, and because not necessarily all what we write as historians is understood, sometimes, or understandable, but let's say that that has more to do with the willingness of others to understand, right, than you, as intelligence is properly not based on it's not based on the amount of things that you know or that you read, but it's on the capacity that you have to read through it, which is literally what the Latin etymology of the term actually means. So, in short, my fascination and interest, also properly from a personal point of view, because we all have our own reasons why we study things, is properly in part, among other things that I also care about, but properly this scientific interest in it's a bet, right? It's a challenge to be able to reconstruct things that, yes, are not yet clearly understood, right? In fact, the answer, the question goes on, says, is this topic in the military historiography where there is a lot we still don't know, since you want to talk about it? Yes, it is one of the reasons. Consider that, I don't know what period you studied, but among, you think, I don't know, what are the sources to understand, like, that tell us what a medieval army is built like, right? Well, you may be surprised to know that factually there is no source that tells exactly how medieval armies were composed integrally. As I was saying before, we have different tools. The most precious ones that historiography simply left aside because they were too lazy to actually make an extensive research on these things. But there is an overwhelming amount of information that basically makes any other source quantitatively ridiculous, is chronicles. Right, chronicles are fundamentally, that this is being recognized also by the new military history. Without that, you can't practically study military history, and especially in the Anglosphere, there is a huge prejudice against chronicles in general, and towards and distrust, I would say, towards properly medieval historiography for a series of reasons that also stem from properly the you see, in countries like England, of course, there were less let's say free commoners, say citizens involved in the political military management of their communities, etc. You have more like the monarchy with clergy that is paid to write. So the bias is understandable, but there the thing has gone beyond by saying, okay, it's more important, as if scholarship was more important than the sources themselves. And that's also a thing that I disagree with. I mean, they should always go in parallel, but if anything, I come from the opposite bias, from continental perspective, that is first the sources first and then historiography second. That also, again, it has its own it has its pros and cons, but it should be always two things in parallel. But indeed, sources in general, if we had to make discuss from the draw, I believe that sources in general always have the upper hand, because sources are always investigable, and especially in relation to each other. So things you can learn are never over, even on things that have been satisfactorily studied by a certain degree. And therefore, through chronicles, you can say, okay, that says that army had 1,000 knights and 6,000 infantry. Okay, so you get that info, and statistically, you treasure it with lots of others, and you draw some conclusions. That's how I wrote an entire chapter of my doctoral thesis, for example. And astonishingly accurate things come out from such studies, right? And historiography, I got a very let's say, nobody was able to criticize what I do, because I'm basically the first one that did it. I think not just in my country, but I think I don't know any work of military history that currently at this point has analyzed at that degree of in depth of that work. So I expected this resistance, but nobody ever proved me wrong. And actually, what turns out to be, even by I used, I think, I don't know how many sources they are, because I didn't count how many quotes they are, because I counted only the notes, but we're talking about something like the tens of thousands, right? And if went from tens of thousands in a period of 60 years in a specific region of Europe, you put that in a, you analyze it, you compare it in chronological order, etc., and certain things come out uniformly from all these sources mixed together, which poses a methodological problem, but they all tell the same thing in the end. You understand that's the Clausewitzian magic, the wonderful trinity that appears, because those sources were freaking right about that. And that's, to me, one of those things. And then you say, well, there are statutes that tell you how armies have to be organized. Well, sadly enough, statutes are dispositive sources. They say how armies should be levied, but they don't tell you how large these are, or how often they were employed, or what they were actually organized like, because much of the administration that regulated eventually the levy, etc., was somewhat based on tradition, because war, by the way, was so frequent that it was absolutely everybody knew already what to do, and always considered this. The fact that we don't have that information doesn't mean that wasn't a developed military system. Let's say, of course, that mirrors proto-statual realities at best, etc. But still, some of these armies were very organized, sophisticated, and plus lots of sources went lost. And in general, there are important things that properly we don't understand, and through those sources you can really do a few. Comparatively, say, scholarly 10 times less that you can do through chronicles, effectively. The same goes for hiring contracts such as the condotte or the indentures that can tell you maybe, yeah, for that expedition we know a unit was recruited, yes, but then how, what did they do? We don't often know it, and how, it's just maybe 50 men, 100 men, and then, from Chronicles the army was, I don't know, 6,000 men. What were those guys doing? We don't know, right? So it's also kind of useless in doctrinal terms, because you don't know how these troops were often used, especially when you see infantry and cavalry together. So often on the field were split. On the same video that you commented on, one of Charles the Bold's Burgundian army organization, was, that is explained, for example, that all the horsemen, albeit the various lances were all they were an autonomous tactical unit. In some cases, they still on the big battle they were arrayed all with cavalry all in one line, and then there were different segmentations with the pikemen, with the archers, and so on. So do we know that? We know that just through battle reconstructions. Fundamentally, that is the only moment in which sources as if flashed put lights on what was an army, as before in any other circumstance they wouldn't tell that, right, and how they fought, etc. And in all medieval history, think about this, that in the whole medieval history, the only source that tells us how was an army composed integrally is the one of the Florentine army at the Battle of Montaperti in 1266. That is, in all medieval history in Europe, and I presume in the entire world, that is the only source that we have telling us what was an army concretely made of. The single only one. And that also was because it was a pretty advanced military culture we were talking about, with tens of thousands of men, specialized troops, a huge supply logistics. How that happened? Well, basically, the Florentines were defeated, and the Senes seized their camp, where there were also these administrative, these lists, literally, of soldiers with names that said whether they were in the army, to which company they pertained, etc. And this thing was treasured in Siena. And then when the Florentines, 2 centuries afterwards, seized the city, they found it and it was preserved. And we realize more or less every army had something like that, and that's the only freaking source that survived out of thousands or more in all the Middle Ages, probably much more. That tells you how limited we are in understanding properly how armies were organized, and how it is always worth the shot trying to understand better on the base of accounts that naturally are, of battle accounts that are often, or as we've seen before, that sources that tell you how large armies were in general, even if they didn't come to battle, etc., to properly understand how they were composed, right? And as I was saying before, a source that decides to make a list as approximate as it can be through narrative sources, that that observes how large armies were, and what was the quote of cavalry, the one of infantry, the one of bowmen, etc. It's not particularly appreciated, right? It should be put in perspective, but there are certain areas that are overly documented in this, and nobody really made a study up to this day. And I presume to have been the first person in the world to have ever done a work like that. And so I bet something on that, and I won the bet because the info I got is perfectly coherent with all the rest that we know from a military, political, and social point of view, and that tells you that the sources were right, and that they're always worth being studied carefully, naturally, because they don't tell you the truth again, but you have to understand more or less also what they are talking about and why. Then the question goes and says, is this a topic in one of army organization in the military historiography? Okay, or say, is there basically some interesting patterns we don't know about where an organization was understood differently in different cultures? Of course, yes. Let's say armies were organized always in a let's say sort of structural sense, meaning that even when you have clanic armies, so with a very low degree of centralization. Still there is centralization. I don't know if you I had some minor quarrels with modernists that have to stress basically in the Middle Ages was pure chaos, everything was decentralized, there was no centralization, not because just the modern age. Maybe you are a modernist yourself, but I've met people that were also military historians that were that stubborn that they wouldn't understand that, of course, in a universal sense, there is always a degree of centralization as long as there is a human society. And this reveals also the degree of ignorance properly in any other field, sociological, anthropological, economical one that a professor can have in the Western world. And the sad thing is that people follow these people and they presume that those are authorities, right? And literally this person once said that, for me, I don't understand tactics. Strategy for me is easier to understand. I mean, if somebody states something like that, it means that properly doesn't understand even strategy. That properly has no idea of what the art of war is, right? And always beware of this. Military historians are not competent about the art of war per se. They have to be specialized in the art of war. And there are very, very, very few people like that. And the negative fallout of this is that if you don't study war, you can't properly even have a strategical education in a country. That is to say, all these schools of strategic studies that are flourishing, that just sound good together, that's just geopolitics, etc. Do they actually study military history? I mean, in a real sense, in the Clausewitzian sense, do they pick literally all the sources available on a given campaign and the various battles and spend their entire life reconstructing them? And it takes a lot. Von Clausewitz studied something like 70. I did just much fewer than that, and it took years, right? Do these people do it? They're mostly political scientists. Of course they don't. Right? Like historians normally don't do it. Like archaeologists don't. Like, in fact, political scientists don't. What's the point of having schools of strategic studies when it's just a sort of weird interpretation of international relations at the end of the day, and there is properly nothing military that is this is also what the new military history has been almost afraid to say, because 80 years ago there was World War II. That is, if you don't study how wars were actually fought and you just roam around without wanting to center that point, you cannot understand anything about war. And together with that, basically 1/3 of the entire human history. And as West, if you wonder what happened, I don't know, in Afghanistan, etc., if you wonder what's happening in the West, is that we have properly removed all a massive chunk of our civilizational intelligence that we had cultivated up to that point, and completely removed it from any scientific or popular, say, meaningful scientific and popular environment, right? So this is why it's a moral duty to study the art of war, to properly learn how to fight a war. That is to say, I have this given military instrument. What the hell do I do in order to achieve that strategical objective? These are things that nobody studies. They don't even study it concretely in military academies. This is another problem. You see, the military, and I'll go. The military is fundamentally trained to perform some. They have some modules fundamentally that they have to be able to carry out on the field and base of orders, etc. But technically speaking, the military doesn't study military history, right? There are a very few, think about Mantis, etc. They mention von Clausewitz, and this is not even a satisfactory condition for them to actually understand him, etc. But properly, they don't. I've seen what it is, a compendium, right? Today, historians of the art of war realistically understand war better than the military, and I'm not kidding about this. Is not I'm not saying that this has nothing to do with being able to fight one, right? Or it has barely to do, because as we were saying before, until you don't go out there and fight the war from a position of command, a real one, you can't get that strategic capacity and education and intelligence, right? But between, let's say, a military historian and let's say, a historian of the art of war, and a guy that has come out just of a military academy as an officer, as I could be, because I went at one point, easily. Like, if the guy is the military historian, has actually studied the art of war, has done the path, easily the historian has a better understanding of war than the officer. There is no doubt about this. It's simply it passes through a neurocognitive attitude to understanding certain systems. It's not it's habit, right? It needs cultivation. It takes years of learning, right? And these are rare, they're white flies fundamentally. In our societies, in our communities, we don't have a critical mass of people with enough strategic education that can put that at the service of the military, of the community in a broader sense, and teach properly. What I've tried to do a bit of this, right? I've made some theory of the art of war videos, not just the Von Clausewitz series, but if you go in the Easter playlist, as a matter of fact, I did talk about important aspects about, also they are all Clausewitz and derived in a way or another, but it's what it takes to have a healthy understanding properly of the basics of military history, art, and strategic culture, which do not quite exist there. Right, so as I was saying, I was trying to, excuse me for digression again, but these are real important things that clans, right? So, say tribes, the ones from which eventually they evolved at some point, began writing down things, etc. Well, those fight by clans. That is to say, it's as if, think of going to war with your family members / neighbors you're somewhat akin to, and going to battle, etc. Now, even in a tribe, there is a central organization, because those clans do not literally roam around the battlefield without order. There is somebody entrusted with command, which the unity of command is a civilizational need, right? There can't be, again, any community without somebody that rules. And the reason being that without those structures, we can't properly direct in a logical and rational direction our force, right? So those clansmen, even if they had a very low level of collective training, which is what makes a civilization from a military point of view effectively, still, in their primitive way, they had a leader that was recognized more or less as the preeminent one, that at least had the capacity, together with others, to have specific guides that were maybe also the clan leaders themselves at some level, that would dispose, for example, those bands of clansmen in a line, right? This may seem banal, but it's actually an important thing. This also began to appear at some point in military history. It is part, in that sense, of a broader civilizational process. But of course, depending on the different doctrine of employment of the military instrument, there were differences in cultures and how armies were organized, right? And that's why studying history altogether is important. You can't also quite study military history if you don't have a political or social understanding, right? The new military history tricked us into the ideological abomination of saying that military that war is important just in function. Let's say for the sake of politics and war and society. Excuse me. They never said the opposite. That is to say that war, politics, and society have all the same importance, and we should study them all. That is, you don't have to study war just because you need to grasp some understanding about politics and society. That is what you have to do, but grasping properly an understanding about war itself. And we are scared to say that. We are scared that there have to be people like me that study war professionally, that is for a lifetime, and that through war, of course, explain more of politics and society. And it's as if, I don't know, I studied only war and not just and not also politics and society. I need to know those things. As a person that studies politics, that specializes in that, that specializes in society, must study war at the same time, right? Instead, there is an imbalance for which war is seen as this terrible, dangerous thing that, if you study it, you're a fascist or an internationalist. No, it's exactly the opposite. If you don't study war, you give room to mentally underdeveloped people like internationalists, because it's like, we made a video about this against culturalism. Culturalism is, as you know, a major, theoretical key of interpretation properly of warfare. Think about Keegan. Think about these. There is no way to justify culturalism if not through racism, because basically what culturalism says is that only barbarians make war. That is to say, war is something stupid and irrational and inhuman, and just psychopaths and other violent people without brain do it. These statements are a denial of the dignity of the average human intelligence, and they are against any single scientific acquisition that we got about human societies, and of course, more developed civilizations actually are proportionally more destructive than others, and there is no doubt about this either. They can understand better what Athena should always lead and not ours in this regard, when to make war. That is to say, war legitimately most of the times is a bad idea, right? It's just the quickest, most rapid solution, but this has nothing to do with considering it as something inhuman or that shouldn't be used, because at this point, if you deny war as an option, you deny the values of resistance, of human rights. I don't know. These are what the principles of universal principles of liberty, for which I would die easily. And if you don't understand, if you don't respect violence as a political tool, in my opinion, you're not a civilized being, right? You don't belong to the realm of civilized people. You're just a tribesman, in fact, a clansman. Same idea, mistaking citizen soldiers with warriors, pretending that warriors are somewhat better. Warriors are essentially the declaration of their self-declaration of their own military inferiority. A society that focuses just on the individual and on its charisma, its prestige, and its private capacity is just an inferior civilization, and that's why we crushed warriors under the heels of the same, because they were inadequate to a civilizational development in a deep moral sense. Because these societies were based, by the way, exclusively on extermination, slavery, and raping, by the way, of their own peoples, because that's also the range of which they very often could just expand on. And this is also another concept that most people don't have. Lots of kids today are just exalted about tribesmen because they think that there is something, pure in it. These people have not received a satisfactory education, but I think properly at a school level. Let's leave aside parents that, of course, are ignorant as them, but properly, that these are the disasters against which we go civilizationally when we don't teach people military history. And this is a massive problem in the West right now, because we should have properly the most crystalline understanding through von Clausewitz, through a healthy, systematic, scientific, rational, anti-dogmatic study of military history, which, not surprisingly, true military historians are the most, honestly, yes, the most rationalist and anti-dogmatic people that exist. I attended my university in humanistic faculties, and I must say that I've met a lot of philologists, of historians of literature, of philology, archaeologists, many. I've found a degree of ideologization and aggressiveness that in the history department I didn't find. Like, history is a real medicine against any form of fanatism and misunderstand, because it teaches you not to categorize, and culturalism in this regard is a serious illness. That is, there are properly military men that are taught by that, and they think that they own some advanced strategical culture understanding, and they're just delusional. Like, guys, we had von Clausewitz. We had something called German philosophy between the late 18th and 19th century. Do we realize what that was? Like in the broader history of mankind, of human thought, do you realize what was achieved at that point? Why do you think that something in the 20th century can even had that built the basis for something alternative without even having taken that into consideration? In fact, failing completely at it. There are people who still quote, I don't know, Little Hart as it. Little Hart was one of the greatest charlatans and frauds in the history of mankind, of literature. It was something atrocious. It was a thief, a liar, an ideologue. It was some of the most disgusting human beings that ever lived. And when you realize how they criticize von Clausewitz, you understand that they have not even read von Clausewitz. Von Clausewitz is extremely simple to understand. I can say it's easy to understand, but it's simple to understand. It is to say you have to work to understand it. But what is written there, once you read it, it's very clear. These people wouldn't even take the time to do it. Why? Because they wanted to be the prima donnas of their own environment, and capitalize economically on that. It's like those people that publish on $10 on Amazon, the comparison between Sun Tzu and von Clausewitz. Like, how can you crash, I don't know, all the time in history of human thought between, somebody that lived at the time of Pythagoras and one of the time of Kant and Hegel, and crashing all the West and Eastern differences in the meanwhile to convince people even to buy your book? Well, of course, if people are that ignorant and properly don't understand anything about military history, or even realizing the fact that this fascination that emerged mostly with Sun Tzu, mostly because, there were wars the Westerners made in the Far East Asia that, they lost, by the way, because of von Clausewitz, because all the communist political, military theory was a Clausewitzian one by that time. It has absolutely nothing to do with Sun Tzu or any other kind of Eastern ancient wisdom or other bullshit of that kind. Of course, if that people are that ignorant, they deserve what they get. That's what I'm saying. And I love to be this polemical because, as I was saying, excuse me, there is no other approach to this. Like, if for somebody who has truly studied these things, like, it's as if I can't find adequate comparisons, because the degree of properly misunderstanding is so great that I don't think there is any other scientific field where there can be a satisfactory parallelism. And I repeat it, this is an illness. It's a deep cultural illness that we have now. It's the flat. Many other things do not help at this moment in history, because when masses have been injected into the educational process without any progressed preparation, whatever, that's what you get, the total sinking of intellectual standards, right? But this is kind of obvious. But at the same time, these structures, the hierarchies, should maintain satisfactory standard. They should higher the standards at that point, because somebody must be truly competent in something, and otherwise all the rest pays for it. Either you do something well or you don't do it at all. This is how I see it. So, of course, different cultures were organized, but in different ways. But because politically and socially they were different, it's obvious that there are, there are some transfer. I don't know, the decimal system. Why does that happen? Because, well, it turns out we have 10 fingers in our hands, and you find that in the steppe as in sedentary peoples. But you see that the steppes also fight in different ways. Why? Because they're nomadic realities, and the sedentary ones behave differently. So, what is important is in studying an army organization is fundamentally seeing how doctrine is applicated on the base properly of a strategical and tactical goal. That is to say, armies do not, as we were saying before, appear on the field autonomously, without an order, without every people fundamentally understands the essentials of war. Like even the primitive tribesmen, as we were saying before, for their own system, they were performing well. Then there was a development political and social that brought in parallel a military change. This is not immediate, this is not directly proportional, but it turns out that human cultures are very quick learners and adapt to the situation, also because there is no such thing like a standard military system that at some point discovers another standard military system and doesn't change, and especially when it sees that it is at a very different level for which it's not even worth to fight in open field, because the asymmetry may be too great to risk it like that. Think about the conquistadores and Native Americans, for example. That's a good example just because you have civilizations that were separated by the ocean for a very long time, so they had a very different a great asymmetry. But again, war is also so much more extensive than how armies are organized, or technology even more at that point, and so that you can't get, as it happened, European armies in the 18th century being ass kicked multiple times around the world by primitive tribes without too much of a problem, because the reality is so complex that there is always a niche that you can find to exploit the enemy inferiority, and that has an enemy vulnerability, let's say, and that has a universal value, and that's how we fight in that regard, right? So it is very important to see such differences, even when you study, Western European warfare in general. That turns out to be, throughout the Middle Ages, quite uniform, especially by the 14th century. There is practically no difference in the essentials of how it was fought by a certain degree, but it's still, that's, let's say, an approximation, right? But then when you study every single army in detail, you realize that there are some differences, that you discovered that in a country, for example, there was more cavalry than another. How is that, right? Especially that if this is feudal cavalry, it's pretty obvious that that country is more of a feudal one, where there are fewer people with a lot of wealth, and the others were too poor to put up even an armed resistance. You have to explain why there are, more skirmishers in a certain reality than another, and this has to do mostly with the political and social background. It has to do with how that society is able to look at what it has and put it at the service of politics as a military instrument, and to be arranged in that fashion. So the following question says, is there too many similarity in regarding to how people understood the army organization during the Middle Ages? Is somewhat correct. That is, yes, there is still a lot to look at, in a sense. There is also sometimes the opposite problem occurring. That is to say, and I studied this, actually my entire PhD thesis was about this fundamentally. It was about early 14th century warfare, and it turned out that we have missed a huge elephant in the room. That is not a little difference about, for example, the use of infantry wings in medieval armies, because there were countries where their use was systematic, with thousands of basically semi-professional specialized troops, even with pikes, that require a level of collective training that is very high. And fundamentally, before the Renaissance, you don't find in a generalized fashion, right? Just in the ancient world, it was like, we think about the Hellenistic phalanxes, etc. But that were there also rose and collapsed were between the 13th and 14th century. Then with the Black Death, infantry they actually lost again in ground over cavalry. There is not a gradual linear positivistic improvement of infantry towards the end of the Middle Ages. The thing goes a bit up and down, and that also tells you how we should check everywhere. But fundamentally, there is a huge problem. That is to say, where did and how these infantry wings emerge in the line, basically on the side of cavalry lines, as they were mostly deployed, also in depth, usually 3 lines. It's a bit of a mystery yet, and also we don't know. Like in certain countries, in a country specifically, this is very well documented. But what about in others? Like that is, and there, it is a problem of documentation, and probably what we know about battles, for example, because as far as we understand, I don't know, infantry wings started being used from in the 30s, the 40s of the 14th century by the English as well, very famously. Also, that's basically the standard formation, the great victors of the 100 Years' War. There were, I don't know, in Italy this existed since fundamentally 60 years already in a systematized function, right? Aside from the fact that historiographically speaking, nobody pointed that out, because, for example, that tells you how important it is historiographically, because the Italians did not study their own military history in those years. Consequently, also foreigners didn't actually care. So basically, we lacked a huge and actually the most developed military context in the scene, without banally, even asking ourselves, but what about these military developments, and did they exist elsewhere, given that Europe was all intertwined and that these countries were all connected? For example, in the great battles of the second half of the 12th century, of the 13th century, like Benevent, Tagliacozzo, Markfeld, Goldheim, we barely have an info about from feudal armies of infantry, let's say on the wings, and or in any other. In Benevent, okay, that was the Sicilians had, because they had the Saracen infantry, but from the French side, right? What about that? What about in Germany? What about in other countries? Some hypothesize that. This is hypothesized. I've seen it, for example, recently for the Battle of Legnitz. But we don't have a proof, because in those battles, the one of Markfeld, for example, I studied myself in depth for a year. We know that infantry was there, but we don't know how it was arrayed. So at that point, you see what happened. Historiographically speaking, people began just to point those realities where that was documented and ignore the others, right? That is obviously an important historical indicator, because if infantries were not named, eventually we know that they were less important in a way, and that fits with the pattern, because in Germany, we know it, especially in the East, etc. But infantries were less important than, say, they were in Italy or in Flanders, right? And this is banal to say, but still, infantries still existed in German armies. So what about those, right? Of course, there are, warring, and there are battles in Germany that show infantry in their use in different ways, etc. But we're talking also about the big ones, like Markfeld, for example, is a battle of excruciating. It was the largest battle of feudal knights in history. Still haven't made a video about that. I'll probably make my master thesis online at this point about that. And nobody gives a damn, just maybe because they can't translate Middle High German, or the same goes for Italian. How many people can translate Italian vernacular sources? Right, banally. And how difference does that make when you have also some of the greatest specialists of the, like De Vries, etc., that cannot translate correctly, I don't know, Tuscan vernacular, and some of the most important battle accounts, such as the ones of Crécy. The same goes for me. I don't know, for example, I wouldn't be able to translate Flemish vernacular. I would have a lot of problems for some battles, but, some things I can't try to understand, roughly speaking, on Germanic languages. But the same goes with French. I mean, people must know these things. I make my effort. I know some language here and there, but it's difficult to get, first of all, somebody that has the interest to study that specifically. And therefore, the question is that literally we may have missed a lot, right? So the fact that something is not mentioned doesn't mean it wasn't there, right? But at the same time, the quotas of these infantries are important. It is to say, by the 14th century, I've studied there, and the most organized armies were pretty much similar, right? Aside from this thing of the infantry, but on the wings, etc. That is important as well, but let's keep it from one side. But let's say, for example, let's pick properly the numerical quotas of the various arms. How many cavalrymen, how many infantrymen? Well, it turns out, even in very close reality that you understand fought more or less in the same way, like in the same country, there are some local differences to say, okay, this region has, doesn't have much of an infantry development, for example. You see, this has to do also with the quality, and that's why it requires a a training in the art of war, because you may have armies that have a lot of infantry, but that may be due to the fact that their societies are poorer, for example, less stratified than others. Therefore, those infantries this is typical of mountain areas. So therefore, those infantries may be many, maybe proportionally a lot, but still not scoring any significant victory against cavalry. Right? When these infantry start becoming richer, for example, they may even become more compact in number, because fewer is not always worse, especially when there is an increase in quality in order and control, etc. There was a big deal at this time. Well, you may see that maybe they were stronger, etc. But usually, especially in the largest armies, that in Europe at the time, we're talking essentially about 3,000 normally cavalry and 30,000 infantry in some of at least the most infantry developed areas. When you see that there are tens of armies recruited like that in some decade, you understand, and aside from you can test their maneuvering capacity, their quality, etc., you understand that their infantry is, even iconographically, you look at how they were equipped, etc. You understand that that infantry was kind of good, and even the fact that it was mobilized in that fashion in those numbers by itself means that they served to something, right? So it's very complicated, as you understand, but when you study a lot of these things in chronological order and comparing all these various realities, you understand what are the patterns normally, right? And that difference does count, right? Because organization is not just about how you have to go equipped, or in how many companies you have to be split, also because those varied dramatically also in size and in level of, in different type of equipment. Lances could be equipped with very different weapons, and then there were certain condottieri that had a very greater bias for a specific arm rather than another. But there is properly also other major contingencies, that is, how many troops can you field in the first place, how many people are going to fight for you politically, are willing to die on the field and being present there that day. That speaks the language, for example, of political cohesion. That is possibly the most important thing when making a war, and you have to measure it through the field. That is to say, through the military instrument. You can evaluate that, but you also have to know the military instrument per se by itself and testing it on the ground. That is, studying battles and understanding whether infantry did something, cavalry did something, and how strong they were compared to one another, how they were deployed, etc. So that's particularly important. When you see that most of these questions have not been answered, because I can't even say that the thing, for example, of infantry wings was a bit of a surprise to people, because they had not focused the problem, and we still have to answer, were there infantry wings there before in other countries? How did they spread? What was the... Sometimes we simply cannot know, because if battle accounts do not tell us, as I was saying before, there is hardly any chance we will ever know. And that's why the art of war can answer partially, maybe to some unanswerable questions, at least by some more conventional pattern, because chances are that, right? Then the question goes again, it says, I have a degree in history, and we never talked about something like an army organization in the Middle Ages. Well, my question to you is, have you ever talked about, war in the first place? That is to say, at university, I don't know here what's the context, etc. But I don't know, how many classes did you have in military history in the first place, and who were these people, and what aspects of war did they actually dealt with, right? So army organization is ever since, I don't know, that's ever since there is war, there is an organization. So it's really that simple. It's that, you see, in military history, things are always simpler, right? Not necessarily easier, but they're always simpler than they sound, right? Because there was right? And it's just, I agree, not a common topic to be discussed in a university at this point. I don't even the alleged so-called military experts of people who study history. They normally don't study these things. They study cultural aspects, etc. Why? Because they're not historians of the art of war. Because if you found me, I would have told you about army organizations, because I think it's very important in this sense, right? It's important why properly doctrine at some point woke up, saying, we need, aside from the basic political and social human material, we need also maybe to implement this arm rather than another. Right, this starts being seen in the Middle Ages in many. This actually is seen always. Right, it's just, it may be more or less important because, as we were saying before, in the Clausewitzian view, war is a clash between moral forces, and that is the single most important thing. That is, imagine, I don't know, war in the Viking era. What kind of doctrinal difference could the Viking make? I mean, more or less, the human material they used was pretty much homogeneous, right? They might have chosen to have more or less cavalry, to implement more or less, ambushes, tricks, etc. But at that point, the overwhelmingly most important thing was to have enough men on the field to give a reason to the clans to join to fight. That is the most important thing, because at the end of the day, it also fought all in the same way. So the difference there was literally made even by banally numbers that are not everything, but also are pretty consistent aspect, especially when the symmetry is pretty low, given that war is always asymmetrical by definition. In the Middle Ages, starting to need firearms, for example, is an important problem. It develops for, it's never like, but not even in modern age, not even today, it's what makes the difference in absolute terms. Of course, today, more or less, everybody has firearms. We don't fight with something else anymore. But let's say, still there are much greater imbalances between properly the ways somebody can employ a military instrument in a place, right? It's not about whether you use an M4 or an AK-47. It's about concretely how much you're driven to achieve what you want and how you exploit the situation. That's what makes the difference, right? This is also very difficult to understand for people today, because for them technology is the eternal illusion, right? It is not today. You can imagine in the Middle Ages, where the technological potential compared to ours was ridiculous. So indeed, it's always, it's not just about underestimating and overestimating how similar medieval armies actually were, but properly realizing that every army is different and is a product of a contingency, and therefore it deserves to be studied, right? So an army organization, yes, is something worth always being taken into consideration, given though that it's always part of a much broader context that you try to offer. In fact, in my army organization videos, I always try to smooth the differences when I see that there is properly no ground for stressing that maybe how they fought in a battle was necessarily due to a doctrinal understanding. It was just product of much more important political contingencies, for example, who was there that day. Then says, I think it's because that the mainstream opinion is that most of the armies in Middle Ages Europe looked like each other, and the concept of army organization was quite static in those years, but maybe I'm wrong. So yeah, I think I as I was saying, this is it's considering the Middle Ages in the first place the problem. It's the Middle Ages had something in common, partially, that we can outline for didactic reasons, but let's say that by pre-industrial standards, aside from maybe the very late introduction of farms, that there are not dramatic differences. Also, Europe is something, I don't know, the Near East. You see, that's why it also extend to many different peoples. But there was a change, and this change is important. Like, I make an example. Look at the Battle of Courtrai. We made a video about this some time ago. I have to re-upload, by the way, because I obscured the track. But there is an important difference between the French army and the Flemish army. That, Courtrai was this battle when infantry alone, for the first time after 150 years in Western Europe, fundamentally managed to win a battle against cavalry. In that video, we explained, I remember at the time was satisfied by it, how fundamentally, as we'll see now, the two armies were very different. But again, it was relatively, there was no magic formula that won the battle, right? Both sides fought pretty well. The same goes for the French in general. That this here always made the charge. It's like the trope, the myth of the 100 Years' War, that the French were just a bunch of idiots because they always went against those English men-at-arms and longbowmen and always lost because they were just stupid, right? This is just a modern mindset that can't believe such an idiocy. And if you study those battles, aside from the fact that the French went pretty close many times, and for other reasons, independently from tactics, to victory, but also aside from the fact they also adapted to those tactics in part themselves, and at the end of the day, they were the ones who won the war. But more so, which is the point that reveals you how much politics and society are connected to war, and how not everything is reducible to how you organize an army or you implement certain doctrinal, you have certain tactics. But it's quite instructive. And at Courtrai, you have essentially a French army that's the typical product of a feudal society, as heavily and most advanced in Europe the French one was. So troops on horseback, some crossbowmen, other infantry in support, etc. But the core being the Flemish virtually having no cavalry. It was just some horsemen, that also dismounted in part because the important was holding the phalanx. Why? Because those were all burghers, were town people. They were commoners who hadn't picked up the weapon up to the day before, in a sense. And that's a hell of a difference. Also because, telling the truth, and this is another mistake that historians and people in general make in popular culture, that the Flemish army was much less developed than the French one. And that has nothing to do with the outcome of the battle, because they won. And they won, why? Because they wanted to kill the French, right? This is also against any trick of seduction of what we can achieve through reconstruction. If you don't want to kill the person in front of you, you can't reconstruct a good anything, aside from the good, the broader historical context that produced that thing. And they stood their ground. They were there to win or die, fundamentally, and they won their day because they had a dramatic moral force that also the French had, because the French made an astonishing effort to break. They actually managed to break through the Flemish phalanx, and then there was a reserve that stamped the gap fundamentally. But that was the way of doing it, and never think, of course, that we are anything more intelligent or capable than a French knight or commander in the first place in the 14th century, because we are not, right? It's a very childish, seductive idea that we, as moderns, we understand history and that we would have done differently. No, you would have brought everything to a freaking disaster, because you would have had no idea of how to handle the situation and all how that was concretely carried out. And this, so that tells you, for example, how differently two neighboring community, technically the Flanders at that point was still within the Kingdom of France, right? So they were literally the same country, but with many differences, right? And that their armies were the proof of that. So that tells you how much they could change. Another thing that scholars, generally speaking, abuse because they base themselves too much on, formal evidence, and they don't reason in those diachronic and comparative terms. Is, for example, how is overstating the applicability of military manuals. You know that in the Middle Ages, more or less, it was Vegetius that ruled the military theoretical environment. Vegetius was read widely, also in relatively archaic times. We know of, Carolingian margraves that read that and wanted also to pass that down to the manuscript to their children. They were also to be men of war at that point. Therefore, there is all a branch of historical studies at this point in the Middle Ages that wants to try to deepen the understanding of whether what Vegetius wrote was concretely applicated in medieval warfare. There was some deep ancient knowledge and wisdom. Let's leave aside that Vegetius himself is the one that in his work says that he knew nothing about military stuff, because he wasn't an expert. He had no competence in that matter. But he wanted essentially to look at how the military Roman military past had been, and how things had gone wrong at that point, which is also a great part of the reason why people still believe that late Roman army was anything inferior to the one of the Principality, while the Constantinian army was easily the most advanced military that the Romans ever had. From Constantine to Valens, basically, And why is there this prejudice? Because, you see, if they had just studied from Claudius, first of all, they would know that any meaningful theoretical application that we can trace is, to doctrine is since the Renaissance, and that before von Clausewitz himself, everything was quite ideal in a sense. Just by the 17th century with Montecuccoli, there was a much more concrete observation on a scientific basis. But if you read Renaissance treatises, they're very, imaginative. Also, the great reforms of the Dutch or the Swedes, etc. Let's leave aside that the Spanish were doing basically the same things from their side, and it's often overlooked. But we don't have even historically a concrete evidence that things really operated that way on the field. I mean, some things, yes, that it was about betting in that specific case that firearms could beat the pikes on the long run, but there was nothing teleological on that point either. But in the Middle Ages, if you study medieval society and war, etc., you realize that nobody needed to be taught how to make war from a manual, and even less the one from late Roman times. I mean, war was something so habitual. The level of militarization was so high. It's been calculated that 14th century France saw a greater military participation per population than the Prussia of Frederick the Great, right? So, albeit naturally in different ways, that you realize, as we were saying before, that even the fact that there are no surviving accounts, let's say documents that tell us how troops had to be arrayed, etc. It's because we know that they were arrayed on the field by people that made war their whole life, that war was always there, that somebody always went to fight them. There was always somebody who knew how to order a line and deploy formations in battle. When you realize, as we were saying before, in comparative sense, so you see that, I don't know, in an area for 60 years, there are tens of armies with tens of thousands of men, and they were used everywhere in the same fashion, etc. You realize that everybody knew. Why did also chroniclers do not tell us about such details? Because they gave them for granted. Some chroniclers were very intelligent. They say very remarkable things, etc. And we are, as moderns, unsatisfied because they don't tell us how they arrayed an army. Because, hell, everybody knew how to array an army at the time. Like, not that every single individual would be able to do it, but, how formations were, everybody knew. And also from the battle accounts, you can kind of reconstruct that at the same time. And what actually they wrote down was extremely accurate. That is to say, the difference that they often explain in doing that is how determined a side was, how hard they pounded a certain line, and that is factually realistic in a way that they would also because there was a general symmetry between armies, especially the ones that fought normally from neighbors, with neighbors, etc. were basically the same thing, and obviously that, unless doesn't tell you that it was a concealed party that was set in an ambush, they attacked from the side and they crashed the line. Yeah, there are things like that. Those they would tell you, because that is relevant. But how they were arrayed, well, that was notorious. Everybody knew it. How interesting would it have been for people to know more? And we can't even fall into generalizations such as, the clergy didn't know it, it just resorted to God deciding the fate of battles as an explanation. Because, for example, let's go far back in time, like the Battle of Fontenoy, 841, the greatest bath of blood in Carolingian history, where basically all counts from Europe went there to die and cut themselves to pieces. We have just two sources on that battle. Let's say aside the fact that in all Carolingian warfare, and you know that the Franks did only war their entire life and literally nothing else. With all the time, the only battle that is tactically reconstructible is one of the few Carolingian defeats, by the way, the one of Zuntal against the Saxons, right? That's the only battle that we have enough information for to kind of reconstruct what happened on the field. For the rest, all the thing is, the two armies arrived, God shone upon that one, they won, etc. Right, for their sins and all that's the story, literally. The Battle of Fontenoy is the same, right? It was huge, but an astonishing amount of people died, but still. Two are the sources. They're both ecclesiastical in a sense, but they're very different in nature as well. One is Nithard, that he was Charlemagne's grandson, and also a lay abbot, and he was fundamentally an abbot, right? And he still, as you know, these were military people. They fought all the time. He died in an ambush against the Vikings somewhere on the Atlantic, and this man was a man of letter because he was a clergyman, but he spent his life on horseback like a true Carolingian. Nithard basically says nothing about how the battle went. Like hell, he participated. He knew everything about how war was made in the 9th century. And when he had to write the story, of course, he didn't give a damn about writing how battles were fought. Everybody knew how battles were fought. Why would he have to write that? It was by far more important to say how things went, because who was right and who was wrong, as a political statement. And he was a man of war. Then the second source is Agnello from Ravenna. It was a clergy, an Italian clergyman, I don't know, properly a person that had never fought in his life and from a completely different background, etc. He actually provides some greater information about the battle and about the movements more before the battle itself, and it's something more logical, coherent. It's also more distant, like, Nithard was essentially he was a Frank, he lived in the Western Frankish kingdom, etc. Agnello wrote from Ravenna, was also more distant from it. He actually provides some greater degree of, strategical information. Now, it's obvious in this sense that what we could know from these accounts would have been much greater. But at the same time, it's more relevant historically to properly know that that's what they wanted us to know. This is something that, even saying it right now, it moves me. I feel like it's a lump in my throat right now, because I think that these people, these words survived the centuries to arrive to us. And that's what the people who were there, wanted us to know what they wrote. And that very specific thing they wrote. And we have to treasure this as sacred. because that can tell us dramatically more about what all makes the difference in war, according to von Clausewitz. The moral dimension, the moral forces, that is the single most important thing in the history of war. And we are constantly neglecting this. And historiography, let's be honest about this, I have basically negative bias towards any single human group on Earth. And historiography sucks, right? Historiography doesn't deserve this. Historiography hasn't made an effort to recover the synthesis capacity of these people. It has stuck to formalistic, functionalistic, technologistic, modernistic, positivistic attitudes that are a waste, a huge waste of time. But the worst is that they pretended to teach others about that, right? That is not to say that, of course, we are doing such a bad job as historians. But we could do much better, and in a sense, what they did was much better than what we do, in relative terms. There is no doubt on this, right? An historian of the 13th or 14th century made a work of synthesis and intelligence that a historian of the 18th century couldn't even dream of, and even less one from our own times. Hell, these were people who could learn the Bible by heart, and that's how far they could push their mind. And what can we do now? Like getting dependent on smartphones and looking at it for every 10 minutes at a screen for the rest of our lives. This is the divide, and why I care so much about the whole thing in general. So I don't know whether I even answered the question. That is to say, obviously, yeah, these are the reasons why you want to know about what an army organization is. Because first of all, we don't know what armies were concretely. We have still a very superficial understanding, and so much evidence that has not been properly studied yet. Secondly, the same armies can reveal us in turn a lot about politics and society as well, right? And vice versa. So that also has not been done quite much, because military history is not studied in the first place, and even less the one of the art of war. So the bridge between the two fields is still very, very weak and frankly unsatisfactory for fulfilling the task. Yes, there are some, let's say, structural differences that are worth noticing in this sense. Always remaining that they weren't, however, decisive per se, and that generally, this is also another very important thing to stress, is that doesn't matter which armies were confronting each other. Let's say that in general, asymmetry was very low compared to our, later times. Let's say that the more developed societies became, and not the greater the absolute divergence, the gaps, the lagging behind, the differences were, in a sense, right? In medieval times, differences were very, very small compared to the later ones. So it's more important, in order to understand these differences, like for the armies, the army organization videos, the military units type videos. First of all, it's important to understand the basics of those community, that world in general. And you see, it's easier in this sense, because given that the world was much more homogeneous at the time, what you see differing is, let's say, it pops out more easily. Like there is less perspective deflection, let's say, than compared to things in our own world that are much more difficult to understand by size. If you wonder also why kids today, generally speaking, are passionate about the Middle Ages, the ancient world, it's because simply they were simpler societies, right? So they are easier to understand. Understanding 21st century United States is something way more demanding, right? Instead, more or less, if you spend some year, you can understand more or less concretely what ancient Greece was, or the early Middle Ages were, because, yeah, most people would still fail without a specific real satisfactory education on the matter, but still they are more approachable in the essentials, right? And that's why instinctively, it's the warrior always instinctively coming back. That is let's say, because it's irrational, because it's instinctive. Civilization, development of it, reason, they're all, and war itself, are all counterintuitive and counterinstinctive themselves. And remember, there is hardly anything more human than war in this regard. That has nothing to do with being a primitive animal. That's just what people that do not understand military history are fundamentally when they express such judgments. On the contrary, war is historically, is the single most rationalized and carefully regulated activity that must have, for that reason, a very sound motivation for those time standards. And even if we disagree with the reasons, etc., in perspective, etc., still those reasons were there and they made the thing move. So it's not for us to just turn our head and say, no, I don't accept that. That's history. That's reality. If you want to turn your head from reality, do it. It's not going to work well. So that's why I hope also to expand on other eras, because there is all a dimensional process that has not been understood, in my opinion, even by scholars. For example, today I didn't talk, and unfortunately now I will, about the so-called idea of the military revolution, right? So let's be honest about this. The only revolutions acceptable are like the French Revolution and the American Revolution, and any other revolution politically meant in that sense. But in military history, there is not even a single military revolution that deserves the term revolution right now. And especially, as you know, from a historiographical point of view, the thing has been introduced from. Also, I made videos about this scatter, about the modern warfare. By Parker, that we are all very thankful towards, because of the very many works that he wrote, etc., etc. But in all, however, he spread this idea of the revolution that naturally is being debated by themselves, by him and all the people that eventually followed him, wrote about this. But believe it or not, as far as I see, that the debate here is not even properly. There are people who oppose him, like, even here it's difficult to, without background, to start rambling about it, but let's say let's make it brutally simple. They are essentially identifying the military revolution in this period that goes fundamentally from the end of the 15th to the mid-15th to the mid-17th century, attributing the term revolution. In scale of importance, what happened exactly from the mid-17th century onwards, read the France of Louis XIV, and all the French military culture eventually, and then eventually Frederick the Great, and then Napoleon, like, by scale, are something that surpass clamorously by, enormously, by the way, much more than the early modern age did for anything in compared to the Middle Ages. In fact, the same, what they call as the revolution. That is literally Western warfare, military art took off from the second half of the 17th century. It was something enormous. In one century with Napoleon evolved even more. It was something huge, enormous. In perspective, why did they have to call revolution, early modern warfare period, for all the reasons that they explain, but not what happened later, in perspective? Because they didn't study it, maybe, and because they are literally masturbating mentally about this, whether to call it revolution or not, or whatever, and people that object of the fact that you can't really make it start from the mid-15th century, because already in the 14th century, infantry was rising in importance. Like, aside from the fact that cavalry also in the Middle Ages had an uncontrasted hegemony just on the Western battlefields just for 2 centuries fundamentally. So even what you have to explain what was happening before and why and this obviously all comes from a series of disgusting prejudices still about the idea of the Middle Ages as a dark pit where nothing happened, where everything fell. The idea that the Renaissance was this grandiose change and improvement in everything. And, yes, the second half of the modern age was instead, well, that doesn't deserve it, right? There are deep ideological, cultural biases stemming from it. Still, of course, from the countries that expressed such ideas, because they all have a mythology about what happened there from their own perspective, etc., etc. And people still, we are cutting trees to print books that talk about this stuff. You realize what's the problem there, and it's idiotic. It's a declaration of strategic educational illiteracy that is intolerable for the 21st century. And again, these words will fall on deaf ears. Probably not yours or the one of anybody who was listening to this, because that's why I make a Schwerpunkt for. But for hopefully not, but I presume for generations, still people will keep believing this stuff. Right? I made, again, a PhD thesis that was incidentally just about that infantry revival in the early 14th century. So I am the one that is exactly telling them there was nothing revolutionary in the first place, nor that has anything to do with the connections with the Renaissance. That is also another asinine preconception. That is to say that it was not only a linear evolution of infantry from the early 14th century to the 15th century, but properly that the Swiss and later pike square armies of pike and shot armies of the 16th century were somewhat connected in terms of properly of army organization and political and social subordination, as the ones of the early 14th century were just a popular / peasant movement and connected with the broader growth of medieval civilization of the 13th century. I mean, I don't even know how to explain this, but if people just were, I don't say that one doesn't have literally to make hypotheses of things he has not studied deeply, right? Because otherwise we couldn't literally do anything in history, but at least having the conscience of realizing the magnitude of the impact of certain things that they do. But again, if people made money like this, I'm not referring now to the military revolution in particular or anything, but they will keep doing it. They will keep misinforming people. So never give for granted that what is written in history books or anything is there for your own good in intentional terms, right? You always have something to learn from it. There is a lot of brilliant scholars that do their job, etc. But the greatest challenge that we have, arguably, actually, in the third millennium, is to create a completely different interpretational method and properly ethos, deontological, properly code to approach history. Because we can't afford anymore to just roam around as if it was a matter of who knows, which, complicated, and so, because that historians, we all do it in a sense. This process was very long and complex, which means at the end of the day we don't understand it, so we throw away we throw out that expression, right? So that people get intrigued and think that we know who knows what. Instead, we don't, right? Because our knowledge is limited. So I think I have shot all my here from my arsenal, the main the highlights, let's say. So naturally, the video is. I digressed on a lot of things that the question didn't really ask. But as I was saying before, I hope to have given at least a broader perspective on what the issue is, right? And also, I thank again my subscriber here that I see here publicly subscribed since 1 year. You're very tolerant for my rambles. And for anybody that has asked me things that I try to answer in my videos, even if I don't directly respond like in this video, but let's say I try to cover these topics, and I'm sorry at this point I'm restructuring the channel, say refreshing it, re-uploading lots of things, and maybe confusion in practice, but let's say I maintain I try to maintain an order in things I say, and I cover many of these things. So yeah. Alright, for now I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.